Hello, my name is Paul Cantor. I'm a professor of English at the University of Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you to a seminar about Shakespeare's Roman plays. This class was given in 2013 as part of the Hertog Political Studies program. The students are all undergraduates. They come from all over the United States. This is a competitive program. Students have to apply to get into it, and they're carefully chosen. And this is an all-star team. If you're not impressed with me, you're going to be impressed with the students. I certainly was. We get some very lively discussions going, and I love the comments from the students. I will stress that this is simply a real-time recording of an actual seminar. It's unrehearsed, unscripted, basically unedited, and we don't do retakes. What we did is what you get here. The course takes up in the historical order Shakespeare's Coriolanus, his Julius Caesar, and his Antony and Cleopatra. And we explore the plays from the point of view of the history of the Roman Republic, what you might call its rise and fall. We cover each play in order, and it's three classes per play, and then one final concluding session. As important as Rome looms in our lives, it was even more so during Shakespeare's time. We call it the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth, and what rebirth meant then was a rebirth of Roman culture and civilization. And Shakespeare very much participated in that. Rome was a subject of great importance to Shakespeare. Of his 10 tragedies, 4 of them are set in ancient Rome. Now, we're doing 3 of them, the plays usually referred to as Shakespeare's Roman plays. His earliest tragedy was a play called Titus Andronicus, which is set in late imperial Rome. It's not a very good play, in all honesty, though there's a good movie of it with Anthony Hopkins, and so I'm not doing it. I actually don't think it's properly grouped with these 3 plays, though many people would dispute that with me. In any case, of his 10 tragedies, 4 are set in Rome. His English history plays make constant reference to Rome, references to Julius Caesar in the English history plays. Of Shakespeare's narrative poems, one is called The Rape of Lucrece, set in the period exactly before Coriolanus. So it seems to have been a subject that was of great interest to him. Now, again, every point I make is controversial. Many people would say, and have said, in fact, that Shakespeare's Romans are Englishmen in disguise. That is a very common opinion throughout the history of Shakespeare's scholarship, was that Shakespeare moved within an English orbit, and that even when he wrote about Romans, he was simply writing about Englishmen. People point to anachronisms in the play. The Roman plebeians have caps, for example, which English common people did, but Roman common people did not. A clock strikes in Julius Caesar. Sundials don't strike. There are a number of such anachronisms. However, I think people who make that argument are missing the real point, which is, in human terms, Shakespeare's Romans really are Romans. They are different. Shakespeare understands the differences. He understands the difference in Roman politics. As we'll see, he was very interested in the nature of a republic, and that he even understands minor Roman institutions like the aediles. Certainly understands the consuls and the tribunes and so on. I'll point to one crucial fact that, in fact, we'll have to come back to again and again. On the issue of suicide, Shakespeare's Romans are not Englishmen. Englishmen were Christians, and suicide is forbidden to Christians. That's Hamlet's big problem. Almost his opening words are about how the everlasting hath fixed his canon against self-slaughter. And Hamlet can't commit suicide because he's a Christian. On the other hand, towards the end of the play, when Hamlet has maneuvered things so he gets himself killed, Horatio wants to join him in suicide. When Hamlet asks Horatio to live on and tell his story, Horatio says, "I am more an antique Roman than a Dane," by which he means, I want to kill myself. Now that does not mean that Horatio was 2,000 years old, but Horatio is telling us there that Christians don't commit suicide, Romans do. That's a pretty important point, and as we'll see, reflects almost everything that's different about ancient Rome. Shakespeare understands that these people are not Christians, and that's one of the central things he's exploring in these Roman plays. In that, I think it was obvious, but in that he was influenced by Machiavelli. That is, so much you've studied Machiavelli's discourses, and I see that you did read Book 2, Chapter 2, and I want to begin by reading a passage from that as a good introduction to Shakespeare's Roman plays and Shakespeare's effort to portray a pagan world. This is on page 131. I'm assuming you have the Mansfield-Tarkov edition. Thinking then whence it can arise that in those ancient times peoples were more lovers of freedom than in these, I believe it arises from the same cause that makes men less strong now. And I think we're going to see Shakespeare's Roman plays are an examination of lovers of freedom, Republican freedom, and also of men who are more strong than the men of Shakespeare's day, which I believe is the difference between our education and the ancient, founded on the difference between our religion and the ancient. For our religion, having shown the truth and the true way, Machiavelli really believes that, makes us esteem less the honor of the world, whereas the Gentiles, the pagans, esteeming it very much, and having placed the highest good in it, were more ferocious in their actions. And then he goes on to explain, the ancient religion did not beatify men if they were not full of worldly glory, as were captains of armies and princes of republics. Our religion, Christianity, has glorified humble and contemplative more than active men. It has then placed the highest good in humility, abjectness, and contempt of things human. The other placed it in greatness of spirit, strength of body, and all other things capable of making men very strong. And if our religion asks that you have strength in yourself, it wishes you to be capable more of suffering than of doing something strong. This mode of life thus seems to have rendered the world weak, and given it in prey to criminal men who can manage it securely, seeing that the collectivity of men, so as to go to paradise, think more of enduring their beatings than of avenging them. It's a fabulous passage, and one that I think Shakespeare was aware of. The discourses were not translated, an English translation of the discourses was not published in Shakespeare's day, but an English translation was circulating in manuscript. And it's my conclusion that Shakespeare had read that. In any case, it's very possible that Shakespeare read Italian. So I'll try to point you some places in the Roman plays that show Shakespeare's knowledge of Machiavelli. In any case, he was perfectly capable of coming to these conclusions on his own. Shakespeare was a well-educated man in terms of the classics. He attended a high school in Stratford whose curriculum was heavily oriented towards Latin work. Shakespeare knew Latin. He would have read people like Livy, and he had read the Aeneid, and he certainly read Plutarch. His main source for these plays is Plutarch's Lives of the Ancient Greeks and Romans. So he knew a great deal about ancient Rome. Again, as we'll see, the details are pretty solid in these plays, often remarkably so, and I'll show you a crucial point at which he even corrects a mistranslation in the English version of Plutarch. So he was interested in Rome, and the plays he chose to write suggest why. Now, we're going to do these plays in the historical order, not the order in which they were written. We're not absolutely sure of the dates of Shakespeare's plays, but Julius Caesar was undoubtedly the first of these three plays that he wrote, and he probably wrote it around 1599. It may have been the play that opened the New Globe Theatre, in fact. And so Shakespeare chooses to write a play at the crucial historical moment when Rome began its turn from being a republic to being an empire or imperial regime. And we see the last gasp of the Republican spirit in the conspiracy against Caesar, and we see the emergence of a Caesarian party and what will become one-man rule in Rome. About 10 years later, 1607, 1608, 1609, Shakespeare wrote these two other plays, Coriolanus and Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra is a very logical sequel to Julius Caesar. It has the character of Mark Antony to provide continuity, and it basically deals, and Octavius Caesar for that matter, and it deals with the aftermath of the assassination of Caesar and the full emergence of the Roman imperial system under Octavius Caesar, who went on to become Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. The odd man out in the plays is Coriolanus. And indeed, Shakespeare's choice of that subject is very odd. Julius Caesar is very famous, Cleopatra is very famous, Mark Antony's very famous. Many other people have done works of literature about these figures. Coriolanus is a much less famous figure. Machiavelli devotes a chapter to him, but I actually wonder if Shakespeare hadn't written a play on this subject, whether there would be anything about Coriolanus in literature. T.S. Eliot wrote a little poem. There are a few other things, but it's largely, I think, because Shakespeare chose this subject. And what the choice of this subject seems to reflect is an interest in the Roman Republic, because Coriolanus essentially deals with the founding of the Republic. It deals with the creation of the tribunate, which in many ways was the most distinctive institution of Republican Rome. Shakespeare couldn't have chosen a better play if he wanted to show the origins of the Republic. As a result, we have three plays: Coriolanus, which deals with the origin of the Republic, Antony and Cleopatra, which deals with the origins of the Empire, and Julius Caesar, which deals with the transition from the Republic to the Empire. So we don't have Shakespeare's diaries, his letters. We don't have anything that indicates his intentions, but to the extent you can look at the layout of the plays, they suggest that he was very interested in the Republican regime and what led to its downfall and what replaced it. So indeed, this is going to be a week-long study of the regime, how a certain disposition of political institutions affects human life. And we're going to see life in Coriolanus is, under a Republican regime, is very different from life in Antony and Cleopatra under an imperial regime. So that's roughly an outline of what I'd like to cover in this week. Any questions about that so far? Okay, then before we start talking about Coriolanus, let me spend a little time outlining the Roman regime, the Republican regime. You've gone over this a bit, right, in Machiavelli, but it would be helpful if I explain what a consul is and what a tribune is. And am I right that would be useful at this point? Okay. As I said, Coriolanus deals really with the origins of the Roman Republican regime. that is, forget about all the mythical history of Rome, Romulus and Remus and so on. Rome was built on a swamp, 7 hills that stick up out of a swamp, but basically it was a very inhospitable area. There were, I think, malaria problems in Rome well into the 19th century, and one of the great achievements of the early Republic was to drain the swamp. But it attracted a rather mixed crowd of ruffians and criminals and otherwise outcasts. At the point where we're beginning here, which is roughly 500 BC, I think the actual date of the events of this Coriolanus of 494 BC, Rome was being ruled by Etruscan kings. This is not a fact they like to dwell on. It's why they invented a mythical history for themselves, and the idea that they were descended from the Trojans, for example. But the Etruscans were a very advanced culture centered around what's now Tuscany, and they were the first powers on the Italian peninsula, and much of Roman culture is in fact Etruscan. Much of early Roman architecture is Etruscan. The famous Capitoline wolf, for example, which is in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, and is supposedly the wolf that suckled Romulus and Remus. That's undoubtedly an Etruscan statue, which the Romans appropriated. This is a problem they had. They felt very inferior to their Etruscan rulers. As we see in Coriolanus, they have just expelled their Etruscan rulers, the Etruscan kings, these Tarquins. And you have to understand, therefore, that the name of king is hated in Rome. This we'll see is very important in Julius Caesar. But the Romans didn't want kings, because kings represented foreign rule to them. And so the whole republic was created to prevent the Etruscans from taking over again and from avoiding the problems the Romans had had with kings. And the great legendary story is the rape of Lucretia. Again, Shakespeare wrote a poem about that. This Roman matron, this paragon of Roman womanly virtue, was raped by, I think it's the son of Tarquinius Superbius, maybe Tarquinius Superbius the Proud, and the expulsion of the Tarquin kings was triggered by the rape of a Roman matron. That's their view of kings. Kings rape your women. And so we don't want kings anymore. And Rome was famous in antiquity for having a regime, a republican regime that was anti-monarchic. Now, this regime consisted of 3 elements. A kingly component, an aristocratic component, and a democratic component. That is, Rome had 2 consuls. We see that as the great issue in Coriolanus. The consuls were the executive power in the Roman regime. They were first and foremost the commanders-in-chief of Roman armies. But they also had other executive functions. They convened the Senate, they convened the popular assembly. But notice the key things, there are 2 of them. And in fact, they had to be in agreement on any major action. You see there the central theme of the Roman Republic. Rome should never be too dependent on one man. When you get to Julius Caesar, you'll see the great complaint of Cassius and other senators is that Rome has become too dependent on this one man. And indeed, we're going to watch over the week Rome go back to one-man rule by the time of Antony and Cleopatra, therefore violating the whole spirit of the Republic, which was to avoid one-man rule. The idea is not one king, but 2 consuls, and the consuls were basically nominated by the Senate and then, in effect, ratified by the people in a popular election. And they served for only 1 year, And for most of the history of the Republic, they could not succeed themselves. You were eligible to become consul again after some interim. But the idea was to have a lot of consuls around. Have the two consuls who were ruling, the two previous consuls, some other consuls from earlier years. They would keep count of how many living consuls there were, the way we keep count of how many living presidents we have. And it would vary. I think at some time there'd be 20 people alive who'd been consul, and that kept a check on any one consul. And even the two serving consuls, because they were only going to serve for a year, and essentially Rome could say to them, consuls, we got plenty of them. Don't give us a hard time. We don't need you. We got several other consuls waiting. That was the idea. You'll see that so many of the rationales behind the Republican system was what we call balance of power and separation of powers. Now, the basic aristocratic element in this regime was the Senate. The Senate consisted of the nobles, the patricians of the city. It was a deliberative body. It devised and passed legislation. It voted on issues of war and peace and treaties. And in some ways, the Senate was the body that decided policy in Rome. And then there was a whole series of magistrates that carried it out. And then there was the popular element of the regime. The people of Rome had a share in the regime. Now, Rome was not a simple democracy, and we have to remember that. And when we talk about Roman politics, we should not simply equate it with modern democracy, despite the fact that we have a Senate and today. I will remind you that we have representative government, and the ancient world didn't know of representative government. A democracy in the ancient world was direct democracy. The people voted on legislation, on matters of war and peace. If you want to see what democracy was, look at Athens and democratic Athens. And our government was designed by the founding fathers to avoid the problems of that kind of direct democracy. But still, Rome had a strong democratic component. The plebeians, in effect, had veto power on any choice for consul, so they had to ratify. And as we see, they essentially veto the Senate choice of Coriolanus as consul. What we see at the opening of Coriolanus is the granting of the tribunate to the Romans, to the Roman people. And that was this very distinctive institution which only the Roman Republic had, of the tribunes. It's interesting, as I was reading, initially there were 2 tribunes and then 5 for most of the history of the Republic, and later 10. It's funny, Shakespeare has it at 5 tribunes, but only shows us 2 of them, as if he knew. I think Plutarch got the details wrong there, and somehow Shakespeare divined that there were only 2 tribunes at this time. In any case, the tribunes defended the interests of the people. They could overrule any decision by a magistrate in Rome on behalf of the people. They could convene the popular assembly. Essentially, they could veto any action of the Senate, and they were sacrosanct by law. It was an act of impiety to kill a tribune. You would think, oh, it's an act of impiety to kill anybody, but it was a very serious fact and kept the tribunes protected throughout their history. The Romans took their piety very seriously, as you may know from reading Machiavelli. And as you can see how close the tribunes get to getting killed in Coriolanus, and Shakespeare doesn't stress this, but in fact historically they had a very serious religious protection, which was a very important part of their power. So this Roman regime is, in a way, very strange. It was called a mixed regime. Now, again, it's not a democracy, it's not an aristocracy, it's not a monarchy. It has elements of all three. Again, the consuls are a bit like kings, though they're deliberately not kings. The Senate is an aristocratic principle, and the popular assembly and the tribunes represent the democratic element. This is how Rome was understood already in antiquity as a mixed regime. The Greek historian Polybius, who wrote, I think, in the 1st century AD. He was a Greek writing under Roman rule, did a history of Rome, and in the 6th book of his history he has a very elaborate analysis of the Roman regime. If you read Aristotle's Politics and his discussion of the mixed regime, Sparta was the great example of a mixed regime in the Greek world, and the theory was that maybe a mixed regime was the answer to the political problem. And did you read all of the Republic? In the later books, there's the cycle of regimes where we go from monarchy to aristocracy to democracy and back. Each of the pure regimes was thought of as having defects, and the hope was maybe if we have elements of the three regimes in one regime, the so-called mixed regime, we'll get a regime that can function. You can see it is a version of the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. And indeed, there's a direct line from Machiavelli's analysis of the Roman regime in the Discourses to John Locke, to Montesquieu, and to the Founding Fathers. I mean, reflection on the mixed regime of Rome eventually leads to our Constitution. Now, again, it's very different from the Roman regime. But still, we have a Senate. We have a lot of newspapers called tribunes. It's amazing how this stuff has survived. And that's why it's important to study Rome. Because the people, you read the Federalist Papers, are constant references to the Roman Republic. And if you want to understand our regime, it's very helpful to go back and understand the Roman regime. And the Roman regime seemed very impressive in Shakespeare's day, in Machiavelli's day, in Montesquieu's day, and even to this day. It lasted a long time. The Rome of Coriolanus looks like a mess, right? I mean, it was fun reading your, I did bring an iPad, and I was reading your papers last night, and somebody said, how did this thing function? I mean, they're idiots. They're all idiots. And it was the striking fact that, I mean, we're going to be very critical of the Roman regime, and we can think of all the things wrong with it. It lasted nearly 500 years. Whether our regime is going to last 500 years, I don't know about it. It's not even half the age of the Republic, and it's arguable that it's changed more in its 2 or more centuries than Rome did in its 5 centuries. In any case, people looked at this Roman regime and said, you know, it looks crazy. It looks jerry-built. Who would ever design this? And yet it lasted 500 years. That's a long time for a regime to last. There's very few examples of a regime that lasted that long. And in the process, it more or less conquered the world. It went from being this swamp with runaways to conquering the entire Mediterranean world. And it's a great, one must remember that the Republic put together the empire. This is one of the few confusing things here. I talk about the Republic versus the empire, but it's the Republic that conquered all that stuff. And indeed, as we'll see, in a way, a very important theme of these Roman plays is that having an empire turns you into an imperial regime. Rome didn't have an imperial regime and then conquer an empire. The Republic conquered all these lands. The empire, the imperial regime added a few things. after the, but most of that great Roman map you look at was conquered by the Republic. A lot of it in the last years of the Republic under Julius Caesar, but still the empire as a piece of real estate was largely an achievement of the Roman Republic. And that was very impressive. And again, to this day, we're very impressed with Rome. But in Shakespeare's day, it was a very open question whether any regime, country, community in his Europe was the equal of Rome in its achievements. They were just beginning to rival Roman architecture. The dome of the Florence Cathedral was the first dome to be larger than the dome of the Pantheon. Everywhere you looked in Europe, again to this day, but certainly in Shakespeare's day, you saw Roman ruins and signs of Roman greatness. Hadrian's Wall, a wall built across the width of England by Roman architects. The city of Rome still had its walls standing, and great monuments like the Pantheon and Hadrian's Tomb, and so on. And people look back to Roman literature as a peak. Really, Dante's Inferno was the first modern work that could dare stand comparisons with Virgil's Aeneid, for example, which Dante invited by packing Virgil into the poem. It's interesting, in 1598, a man named Francis Mears, trying to show that Shakespeare was really great, systematically compared his plays with Roman plays. I mean, real Roman plays, plays by Plautus and Terence and Seneca. And the way you showed that Shakespeare was a great author was to say he was the equal of these Latin playwrights and so on. So the Roman achievements seemed incomparable in Shakespeare's day, and I think these plays in some ways are a meditation on how was that possible. How did this ragtag group of swamp-dwelling Romans manage to conquer the world and build this great civilization? So I think the plays are a very serious meditation on Rome's achievement and a question of how it came about, and that Shakespeare concentrates on the differences. And one of the main differences is paganism. And that's something we've got to examine, how Shakespeare's in some ways connects the political achievement of these Romans with their paganism. And also this issue of republicanism, a republican regime. Now, Shakespeare lived under a monarchy, and the common assumption has always been that he knew nothing but monarchy, and that all his thoughts were in terms of monarchy. I always like to point out to people that 4 decades after Shakespeare's death, England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans. Where the hell did that come from? You know, it's like you read analyses of Shakespeare and, you know, he's only thinking in terms of monarchy. He wrote these 10 English history plays about the monarchy and so on. Yet here in Coriolanus, he is seriously interested in how a republic functions. And people in England must have been thinking in terms of a republic in Shakespeare's day, because 40 years later they had one. Didn't last, proved to be a disaster, but Machiavelli reintroduced the theme of republics to political philosophy. In his discourses, people in England were reading Machiavelli. They weren't openly reading Machiavelli. They weren't coming to court and saying, hey, Queen Elizabeth, just reading this interesting in Machiavelli about how republics are superior to monarchies. No, you didn't say that at court. Indeed, there were all sorts of reasons why people's interest in republic was kept underground. But as I say, someone must have known what a republic was in 1600, because by 1649 they had one. And suddenly had a lot of thinking about republics then. And I think Shakespeare is part of that. I'm not saying that he necessarily supported republics over monarchies, though it's interesting that I think in these Roman plays the republic comes out looking pretty good compared to the monarchy that emerges at the end. But it's at least worth realizing that Shakespeare was interested in something other than Elizabethan England and its monarchy. I think these plays reflect the fact that he really wanted, well, how do these republics work, and how is that connected to a pagan religion? The same kind of reflections you get in Machiavelli. And in particular, the thing that Shakespeare is fascinated by is, can there be a regime which engages the energies of all the people? Now, again, this is not simple democracy. I'm not clear, it's very tempting to impute to Shakespeare every one of our own cherished ideas. We would like to think that Shakespeare was a Democrat because we live in a democracy, and I've seen people that basically argue that Shakespeare wrote the Declaration of Independence, and I don't buy that. I don't. He seems to have a lot of doubts about pure democracy, judging by Coriolanus. But he does seem to be interested in a regime that it can engage all its people. Not fully. I mean, the plebeians do not have as much of a role in the Roman regime as, say, American people have in our American democracy. Still, they are not completely disenfranchised, and I think that's what fascinated people like Machiavelli and Shakespeare with Rome, that it gave the people a place in the regime without its being fully democratic, and that seems to give the regime a lot of energy. I think Shakespeare, like Machiavelli, was fascinated with the issue of how could you engage the energies of the people in the regime? How could you give them an active role in it? And what Rome represented was energy. That's Machiavelli's conception, that this regime, which looks like such a mess, which is always in tumult, at the same time it seems to generate this great military virtue, this ability to conquer all its enemies and indeed conquer the world as known then. So with that prologue, again, any questions about that? This is, again, we'll understand this much better by Friday. I just want to give you an outline where we're going. So let's plunge right in. I know some of you already thought about this, and talk about this Roman regime, and chiefly these two parties in Rome, the plebeians and the patricians. I'd like to characterize them and also analyze how they interact. So, somebody tell me about the patrician party. What characterizes them? Yeah.
The patricians think that they're better. In fact, they know it. Their condition, their nature is better than the plebeians. And Memenius uses the symbol or the image of the belly to describe the patricians, and they are the people who digest, who get the wealth, and they make the laws, and then it filters out through the bloodlines to all the different people. And so they characterize themselves as not greedy or not taking everything away and storing it for themselves, but the workhouse, the factory for all the others. So while they're proclaiming their own kind of inherent superiority, they're still saying that they're helping the people. So they kind of play the game, and they try not to make themselves hated.
Now, that's a good starting point. It's very hard for us to understand anything but a democracy. I mean, we live in a country where all people are created equal. It's very interesting that you said that not only the patricians know they are superior. This really is a fundamentally aristocratic order, where there are aristocrats and there are common people. And again, to us, that's completely artificial and crazy. But for a lot of the world, including Shakespeare's day, there was a belief in aristocracy. Why are the patricians better? What makes them better, or what are the signs of their being better? Yes.
Fight for Rome.
Okay, you want to explain that?
Well, there's that moment in the play where Coriolanus is like, come fight, more
Yeah.
attack, come fight for me, and the plebeians kind of slink away into hiding, whereas he's like, no, we have to go fight.
Yeah. So the chief manifestation of their superiority is a military superiority. These are the military heroes. And you have to imagine them as bigger and in better shape, not Menenius, but Coriolanus and Comitius. Coriolanus says in Act 3 of the Plebeians, on fair ground I could beat 40 of them. And that's true. That's the thing. You got to picture a samurai movie here with Toshiro Mifune, and there's 40 guys coming at him, and he kills them all. It's not even the world of a gun. See, it's a world of swordsmanship where there can be a guy who can beat 40 other people. Now, again, we don't live in that world. You just pull the gun on him, on the great swordsman. The guns are great equalizers. This is not a world of guns. It's a world of aristocratic virtue where that virtue is chiefly military. But what else? What else would they point to show they're better? Yeah.
Part of the reason that when you look at why they think they're better, it's what they think of men.
Yeah.
About them as a hydra, and so it's like a monster that just can't decide anything and is sort of devouring everything in its path. But they have a very specific view of the Plebeians, sort of the lowest of the low. They're just sort of driven by appetite. They don't think about anything at all. There's no digesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So we nobles are nobler. We are deliberative. That's the great claim of the Senate, that we don't rush off and do things. It's like we would say the lower classes have a short time horizon. They're just interested in food. They're interested in these contemptible things. We take the big picture. What else? It's in a way too obvious, but you actually see it in their view of the plebeians. Let's get really down to brass tacks about it. What do they really think of the plebeians? What? They're filthy. These people are dirty. They're poorly dressed. They have real contempt for these poor people, and we're rich. We patricians, we're rich, and that means we have better clothing. Now, again, we're in some ways the poorest person in the United States is better dressed than the best aristocrat of these times. But in Shakespeare's day, they still had what were called sumptuary laws, that depending upon your social class, you couldn't wear certain things. Even if you could somehow afford silk, you couldn't wear silk if you were a commoner, because silk was reserved for the upper classes. I mean, these things are unimaginable to us. I just want to work to help you recover what an aristocratic world was like, where the social differences were visible. Now, there's, we can tell a rich person's dress from a poor person's dress now, but it is not as stark as the contrast in, say, Shakespeare's world or the world of Coriolanus. You can just look at someone and tell if they're a patrician or plebeian. You can see it in their dress. You can see it in their personal hygiene. Quite frankly, the plebeians smell. That's a very strong, they have bad breath. This is a strong, Coriolanus has such a sense of the bad breath of the plebeians. Shakespeare was an actor, by the way. You got to imagine him up on stage and what Elizabethan bad breath must have been like. The wave that came up. Shakespeare's plays have continuous references to the bad breath of people. Remember, there's bad dentistry. I mean, there's no Listerine. I mean, the Elizabethan breath must have been a wonder to behold. So this really is a world, two parties, patricians and plebeians. The patricians think of themselves as noble, and the plebeians are base. Again, so much of it is founded on the military superiority of this patrician class. And again, think samurai. It's the closest thing in our culture that can get to this. And Japan had a military aristocracy much longer than most countries. And also remember, it's a world where the military is more crucial. I mean, the life of every Roman depends on that army. This is very early in Roman history. Rome is just Rome at this point. They got enemies just down the block, the Volscis. Now they conquered the Volscis. They conquered everybody eventually on Italy and eventually the whole Mediterranean world. But throughout Rome's history, you had to worry if you lost a battle, you lost everything. Your women and children were enslaved, your men were killed. The ancient world was very nasty. War was a war of annihilation, and the very survival depended on. If you wonder how the people can put up with this jerk Coriolanus, how they can put up with this, it's because they need this guy. And again, somebody saw that in the papers last night, that you're crucially dependent. And again, picture, how many of you have seen Seven Samurai? Okay, that's pretty good. But I mean, if you picture the awe with which the peasants in that view the samurai, you got some sense of what's going on here. How in a military aristocracy, the top dogs look almost like gods to ordinary people. Again, you can see that in Coriolanus. If you know the Iliad, it's what's going on there. If you put together a military hero, a politician, a movie star, a rock star, and a pro wrestler, you have some sense of what a guy like Coriolanus looked like to the average person. I mean, just a physical presence that you could feel that he could beat 40 of you. So again, the patricians, in some ways, they're very foreign to our whole democratic sense, but it's part of the play that they do have an important status. Now, the plebeians, we've already, it's almost impossible to discuss one party without the other because they are sort of defined in opposition to each other. But tell me something about the plebeians. Actually, were there more comments on the patricians? Yes. Yeah, it's a very, very strange passage. Now, Shakespeare inherited it. It's in Plutarch, in a source. It's also in Livy's account. This fable of the belly was associated with the story of Coriolanus in antiquity. So he's following the sources there. Nevertheless, it's extremely interesting that Rome lacks a head. You would think the defense of the patricians would be, we're the head, we're the brain. And it does suggest something about this Roman regime, that it's not dominated by reason, the way, say, Plato's Republic would be, where you've got philosopher kings. You got belly kings here. And we'll come back to this because it shows something I think very important about the patricians and Menenius in particular. Anything else about the patricians? Okay, the plebeians. How would you characterize them? Yes.
I think there's a really interesting line on 62 where Cecilia says, why either were you ignorant to see it or seeing it with such childish friendliness to yield your voices? And there's a way in which the plebeians, I think, they have pretty pathetic complaints that they're going hungry or they're on the verge of going hungry. They'd like something to be done about it. And they're also fairly lacking in guile in that, you know, they may make poor decisions at times, they may not be the most deliberative, but there's a childish quality to them where they kind of just respond to whoever tells them this is in your best interest. And I think there's a way in which, whereas the tribunes are maybe condemned to a greater degree, the plebeians are just seen as sort of maybe not not particularly sensible people, but they're not necessarily ill-intentioned either.
Now, but the tribunes are plebeians.
Right. But
Yeah.
I think like Brutus and Sicinius are a little bit more. They're developed as characters to a greater extent.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. But yeah, the plebeians are like children in the good and the bad sense. I mean, there is a certain naivete and innocence to them. They're not evil-minded. For example, a lot of them admire Coriolanus. I mean, with good reason. But it's this man that hates them so openly. They can still see he has his virtues, and particularly in the Roman military regime, he's very important as their greatest soldier. On the other hand, they're extremely fickle. One thing we see is they can't stick to a decision like children. So again, it's again, we wish Shakespeare were just a modern Democrat, but no, he's very sympathetic to the people. He shows they have legitimate complaints. He shows us they're being treated with unnecessary contempt. On the other hand, he also gives a strong sense of why they probably should not be in complete control. If they were in complete control, Rome would have a problem. Indeed, checks and balances wherever you look here. The patricians would create a problem if they were solely in control. The plebeians would create a problem if they were solely in control. So maybe the answer is create a regime where they're at odds and have some chance of balancing each other out. Anything else about the plebeians? Yeah.
I think another key feature about them is how numerous they are. I mean,
Yeah.
Coriolanus might be able to kill 40 of them, but there are 40 and many more to overwhelm all of the patrician class. So the very fact that Menenius has to come out and make this elaborate analogy represents the fact that the elites know they have to pacify the masses there to survive. So I think the key question in terms of balancing the people in the state is this recognition that the people can't lead themselves, but the aristocrats have to take their interests to heart to some extent, or else they will be in a position to kill them.
Yeah, and for that matter, they need him in the war. I mean, we're given this incredible scene where Coriolanus single-handedly enters Corioli and seems to take on the whole city, which is the ultimate image of the samurai warrior, that or Luke Skywalker with his lightsaber. I mean, that the one Jedi Knight could take on everyone. But realistically, you need some common people in the troops. Yes.
Yeah, I was also thinking that something that's important about the numerous quality is that they're also seem to be much more purely political than the patricians. Like Coriolanus has a family. He seems to have divided loyalties frequently between his family, his class, his city. Whereas the patricians, plebeians, basically care about the plebeians and they care about the city, and that's really where their interests stop. And I think part of that is because they are a multitude. I would say if you were a play about a plebeian, they would talk to their family, but there's a way in which I think because they're not an aristocracy, there's no sense of like my family's honor or my family's duty in the same way that there is.
Yeah. On the other hand, they are concerned about very basic human things, chiefly food. And presumably that's to feed their families. It's funny that if Shakespeare had written a play about a plebeian, it would have been a comedy. Shakespeare's tragedies are always about nobles. And that's part of his conception of tragedy, that only serious people can be the subject of tragedies, people whose decisions affect the whole of the community. But it's interesting. The plebeians clamor for food and accept tribunes, which shows that they, in some ways, their real complaint is political. They are answered not with the food they wanted, but with an institution that will help them gain their interest in the city. And also there's a strong sense that the issue is their dignity. They are being treated with contempt, and they're asking for food. They accept something that gives them some dignity in the city, that gives them some stake in the city. Now the question is, how does this crazy regime function? It's got these two parties, and now we're used to party government. We accept it as a fact of life. I will point out there's nothing in the Constitution that says, and there shall be a Republican Party and a Democratic Party. Our Constitution completely ignores the fact of parties, even though party government has become a fundamental fact of human life in America. Parties in the ancient world were looked upon as a defect of a regime. If a regime had parties, it meant it wasn't settled. It hadn't decided if it was an aristocracy or a democracy, for example. And you can look at Athens going back and forth between aristocratic and democratic regimes. That's not an aristocratic and democratic party within a regime. No, the aristocracy comes to power, it kills all the Democrats. The Democrats come into power, they kill all the aristocrats. The aim is Athens should be one or the other, not a mixed regime. Here's Rome with this mixed regime, and again, Machiavelli's defense of it, in effect, becomes the first defense of party government in political theory, and Meditations on Rome lead all the way to the modern theory of party government. How does Rome work? This is crazy. We got the patricians and the plebeians at odds. They are so different. The patricians are noble. They're only concerned with their honor and war and doing their duty. And the plebeians are a multitude. They're worried about food and these common ordinary concerns. How in the world does this regime function? I'll ask you this. Where does the negotiation take place between the parties? Or between whom does it take place? Yeah.
It seems to almost take place on two levels. For in one sense, it's very in the public forum where the people and Coriolanus addresses in the public forum. And with that being said, also the people seem to be somewhat directed by two members that are kind of behind closed doors, which the two tribunes kind of guide or decide what the public wants.
Yeah.
So it's both very public but also private and behind closed doors.
Now, in fact, Coriolanus and the people cannot talk to each other. They shout at each other a lot, but they cannot talk to each other. Who can talk to each other? All the senators? Okay, yeah. One thing to note in this play is the real political negotiation occurs between Menenius and Sicinius and Brutus. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now, Menenius, how does he differ from the other patricians? Yeah.
He's very good at making compromises. At that level, he does seem very deliberative, but he's not making a lot of knights of himself for it.
Yeah. Anything, again, what makes him the best patrician negotiator with the plebeians? We talked about the oddness of the fable of the belly.
He does see that, the fable of the belly does portray the patricians as being sort of useless. He talks about it as the belly being idle and unactive.
Yeah.
Simply, basically a vacuous hole.
Yeah, it's so. Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's Shakespeare saying it or Menenius saying it, but there's a way in which he's also critical of the patricians.
Yeah. Yes.
But at the same time, I think that helps him appeal to people because he doesn't try to deny the obvious realities that underlie the people's objections. He's not going to say, "Oh, we actually are really active," despite the fact that we're lounging around all day.
Yeah.
He's like, "No, that's true, but even with that fact, you still can't live without us." So
Yeah.
he's trying to appeal to the population
Yeah.
on their terms.
It's certainly, his behavior is strongly contrasted with Coriolanus. He's willing to talk to the plebeians. He approaches them on their level. He gives them an interesting tale. And he cares about the belly. the plebeians care about the belly. It begins, they're hungry. They're concerned for food, and part of his speaking to them on their own level as he talks about the belly, whereas people like Coriolanus act as if they didn't have bellies. Where does this come up later in the play, Menenius' concern for the belly? It's something that Shakespeare chooses to emphasize. When he goes to see Coriolanus to try to talk him out of conquering Rome, what does he worry about? Menenius. Hath he dined yet? He's very worried about talking to a guy on an empty stomach. It shows his plebeian quality. He's the one patrician who's always caring about the belly. Whereas with Volumnia, after Coriolanus is banished, when Menenius suggests, well, let's go have a meal, she says, angers my meat. I sup upon myself. That's the patrician attitude, that we don't care about minor, ordinary things like eating. We're above that. But Coriolanus is so, Menenius is so worried. He even asks the guards, has he eaten yet? Menenius' attitude is, if you're well fed, you're easy to deal with. And so here's the interesting thing then. Menenius is the most plebeian of the patricians, therefore the most likely to be able to communicate with the plebeians. Now, how about Sicinius and Brutus? I stopped you when, to point out that they are plebeians. Yeah.
They certainly seem much sharper than the rest of the plebeians, and they're certainly interested in their own personal gain to a greater degree than
Yeah.
if Coriolanus is concerned with his honor and glory, there's a way in which Sicinius and Brutus are also concerned, at least with their office, if not their glory.
Yeah.
They really
Well.
want to perpetuate tribune, and not necessarily for the plebeians, but so that they can.
Yeah. They are, in fact, proto-demagogues. They're the ambitious members of the plebeian class. In fact, Menenius says to them, you're ambitious for poor knaves, caps, and legs. And they turn out to be pretty shrewd politically. They understand what the patricians are doing, what Coriolanus is doing. They manipulate the plebeians in the election situation. So you've got, if you will, the patrician element of the plebeians. They're pint-sized patricians. They're ambitious for poor knaves, caps, and legs. The patricians would treat the plebeians, the tribunes, with contempt. Who wants to be a tribune? But to Caesar Bruce, that means something. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a way in which they're sort of the new princes. I think that's really that they're the ambitious men who are rising from very little, whereas Coriolanus, I mean, yes, he has glory by conquering and by defending Rome, but he's essentially inheriting his position. There's a way in which there's less glory to be had.
Yeah. Well, again, I wouldn't push it that far, because this is still a world in which military glory is central. And again, I think you can hear in Menenius the patrician contempt for the ambition of Sicinius Brutus. Again, you are ambitious for poor knaves, caps, and legs, he says anachronistically. But still, again, Shakespeare is the only person I've ever seen analyze Roman politics this way. I think it's a very subtle understanding of. I think it goes beyond Machiavelli here. That the plebeian element in the patrician class was the point of communication with the patrician element in the plebeian class, and that's where the negotiation takes place, and that's that if Rome were divided into a purely noble and a purely common party, there would be no communication. But because there's a certain messiness to it, and patrician types are born among the plebeians, and plebeian types are born among the patricians, they provide the point of contact. And I think that's very important to the functioning of Rome here, and why it does in fact function. communication does take place. Again and again, we see scenes of Menenius speaking to Sicinius and Brutus. And again, it's not calm deliberation, and there's a great deal of hostility there, but there's a sense in which they are able to communicate. If you look at, let's see, it's Act 2, Scene 1, say the top of page 39, Menenius says, "I am known to be a humorous patrician and one that loves a cup of hot wine with not a drop of allaying Tiber in it." That's his basically saying to him, I'm your type. I like a good drink now and again. It's like what goes on in this city where people from the rival parties still eat in the same restaurants and drink in the same bars, and that's the only way the government functions. There you can see line 69 on that page. "You are ambitious for poor knaves, caps and legs." That's the line I've been referring to. So there's a certain human reality that makes this regime function. Now, as we see in the first act, military glory is very important in this city, as in some ways the keynote of the whole play is the speech that let me see if I can find it. It's page 51, where Cominius says, this is about line 85, "It is held that valor is the chiefest virtue." Really want you to contemplate that quite seriously, that this is a city in which valor is held to be the chiefest virtue. Could that be said of the United States right now? Could someone get up in the United States, could the President of the United States say, "It is held that valor is the chiefest virtue"? What would happen? Yes.
I think that the president would be rebuked, or at least before, because it's seen as kind of almost like a primal virtue to us nowadays. It's tied directly to war or conflict.
Yeah.
People would think something like prudence or compassion would be.
Yeah. In other words, you might get up on Memorial Day, or at and say it is held that valor is the chiefest virtue. But people would actually do a double take if an American president would say that today. I can imagine moments earlier in our history, like during the Revolutionary War, when they elected George Washington president. We've elected a surprising number of generals president of this country, which is, valor is a pretty important virtue still in our country. But the chiefest virtue? You'd get in a lot of trouble if you said that. And you're right. I think, people's compassion. What about compassion? Yeah. Yes.
I would also really value valor, but valor that knows how to disguise itself. So one thing that Coriolanus can't do is he can't be an actor, and he can't appeal to the people and pretend to get on their level like Menenius does. But we see that in our politicians. We like our politicians who can kind of roll up their sleeves, take off their ties, and
we're very democratic.
Yeah.
And again, I do want you to see that this play is portraying a fundamentally aristocratic regime in which everybody accepts the fact that some men are better than others. And Shakespeare lived in such a world, and he definitely portrays one here. And it's remarkable, and in a sense a tribute to the plebeians, how much they're willing to grant these patricians. The patricians have to, as in the case of Coriolanus, have to act with utter contempt of them before they say, "Wait a minute." They're really disposed to think these men are better, and one reason is because on a fair ground they could beat 40 of them. They look at these guys and say, "Wow, these." The only place I think we still have a sense of aristocracy left in our culture is athletics and entertainment. That our movie stars and our sports stars. Have you ever been next to a professional football player? They really look like another species. I'm not kidding. It's hard to think you're of the same species. And I once accidentally stayed with the Cleveland Browns in a hotel. And I'd gotten bumped up to the VIP floor. They were staying there for obvious reasons, but the hotel screwed up my reservation. And I was there with the Cleveland Browns, and it was brunch. And I walk into there, and the offensive line of the Cleveland Browns is between me and the buffet. And I love buffet, but there's no way I'm getting to that buffet. And one of them turned around and just laughed, and kind of the Red Sea parted, and they left me a path to the food. But otherwise, these guys were gigantic. And then the funniest thing, they were there for the Hall of Fame game in Canton. When they go down to their black SUVs, they have bodyguards. Can you believe that football players are bodyguards? And these guys are twice as big as the football players. And there's me just looking at these people like they're another species. And that's the way these people look at Coriolanus. Yeah, there was someone had a point here. Yes?
Well, I was just going to say, I think as Coriolanus sort of hinted at, the fact that Coriolanus views valor as the chiefest virtue is also a downfall.
Oh,
It's a great weakness for him to not be able to consider anything else as
yeah.
to just moderate.
Yeah. What I want you to see is Shakespeare is examining here a community in which valor is held to be the chiefest virtue. Doesn't mean Shakespeare thinks that valor is the chiefest virtue, and you're absolutely right that we're going to see the limitations of valor as a virtue and the limitations of a community that thinks valor is the chiefest virtue. But I do want you to consider, what a community would be like that held valor to be the chiefest virtue. It is such a community that might, for example, go on to conquer the rest of the world, and especially conquer communities where valor wasn't held to be the chiefest virtue. So again, this is the puzzle. How did these Romans do it? They beat everybody. They've rarely even lost a battle. And if they lost a battle, you really had to watch out, because the next battle, they annihilated you. And it's a peculiar notion. Now, why do they hold valor to be the chiefest virtue, or what does it mean in larger terms to do so? Why don't we hold valor to be the chiefest virtue? Yeah.
Well, perhaps like you were saying before, for them, the safety of the city rests upon the military prowess of the army. And if the army loses, then everybody dies. Whereas we live in a world where the threat of warfare is not omnipresent, and we have the freedom to consider things like compassion to be more important. That's really a matter of life and death.
Yeah, that's certainly a key. What else?
Well, I think that Nietzsche would say that certainly part of this Christianity, that we have this sort of total flip in the way that we see the world, and that we no longer can hold valor to be the chiefest virtue, because we also have to be humble and compassionate.
Yeah, see, that's definitely Nietzsche. It's also in that passage I read to you from Machiavelli. I mean, one reason the words valor is the chiefest virtue would stick in our throats is Christianity. That is, that we've been taught compassion is a virtue, so we can't say that valor is the chiefest virtue. There was
Going off of the Christianity point, there's also just much more acceptance of worldly glory, and reputation is so important. And Coriolanus talks about how, like this desire for men to remember him as great, he would rather, die and keep that than retreat and live, and then to have his valor be questioned and no longer be an honorable man.
Yeah. Now, why are they so concerned about reputation?
Because the way that you have valor is by the recognition of others.
Yeah.
And, you can be a great man, but unless you have that name Coriolanus, then no one will know.
Yeah. So, yes.
The obvious, I think, Brandon.
Yeah.
It's a way to get immortality, that people remember you. That's the way to get immortality.
It's the only way to get immortality. Now again, we'll keep reflecting on this, the way this world of Coriolanus differs from a Christian world. There isn't the slightest hint of any notion of an afterlife in this play. Now, it's a very complicated issue what the ancient Greeks and Romans thought about the afterlife. In some ways, the most important fact is there was no canonical view of what the afterlife was. In any case, generally speaking, even when the afterlife is portrayed in the ancient world, it's pretty negative. There are these images of the Elysian fields occasionally, but really you can take the Odyssey as definitive. Odysseus goes down to the underworld, and Achilles is basically saying, I'd rather be a slave and be alive than be king down here. And that's a pretty good measure of how negatively the afterlife was understood, even to an extent it was believed in. And certainly Shakespeare omits any mention of the afterlife in this play. We'll see how that becomes crucial in the plays that deal with later Roman history. So you're not going to heaven in this play. You can't say, I'll act virtuously, I'll be compassionate, I'll be charitable, I'll be merciful, and then I'll go to heaven. No. The main opportunity in this play is win a big battle, get a big name, and then you'll be immortal. That puts a lot of pressure on the Romans, and again, it's what Machiavelli suggests in that passage I read to you, and what Shakespeare suggests, that what generates this powerful military regime is the glory-seeking of its heroes. That it's basically the only immortality is the immortality of fame here. Who are the gods in this play? How are the gods characterized?
There are references to Jupiter.
Yeah, there are some references to,
Fortunes and gods.
yes.
The gods do not seem to be, pulling the strings though here. It's a very mortal-centric view, at least as Shakespeare portrays it.
Yeah, it's a world where the gods help those who help themselves. That is, if Coriolanus basically says, "Fortune, if you want for let's fight, and then we'll find out who wins." But they're Roman gods. What does that mean? Again, it's hard for us to recover such a different world, but Shakespeare does seem to have understood it, and
They're political in some sense. They're tied to everyday life. They're not abstract in the sense that people are seeking them. They only seek them for very means and ends related matters.
Yeah, and they're tied to the fortunes of Rome. You pray to the gods for Rome to win a battle. You pray to the gods to end the strife in the city. If you look at it's actually very interesting in the opening of the play when Menenius is addressing the common people. He speaks about, this is page 10, about line 185. What's the matter that in these several places of the city you cry against the noble senate who under the gods keep you in awe, which else would feed on one another? That's a grammatically ambiguous phrase there, under the gods. The proper way of reading it is that Menenius is saying that in obedience to the gods, the noble senate keep you in awe. But it's very easy to read that as saying the senators use the gods to keep you in awe. And indeed, we see a regime that identifies itself with the gods. These are gods of the city. Now, again, this is so different from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that we have to work a bit to recover what it meant. We, in the great monotheistic religions, have a universal God. But I can assure you the Volscians and the Romans worship different gods, or if they're similar in name, they're worshipped under different civic aspects. It's again, we all talk about the Olympian divinities and Jupiter and Apollo and Aphrodite and so on, and those are late literary developments. All those gods were actually specific to cities. The Athenians did not worship the same gods as the Spartans. The Romans didn't worship the same gods as the Volscians or the Etruscans. Often they had similar names, and eventually they kind of blended together in the Roman Empire. But for most of ancient history, the gods were very specific to cities, and the cults of the gods were civic. The Athenians happened to worship Athena. They thought of her as having a particular interest in their city, but it was always the god was thought of as physically present in the city. You went up to the Parthenon and there was Athena, this great cult statue of her. I remember, in case you don't know, there's a replica of the Parthenon in Nashville. Anybody seen it? I actually recommend it because it's not a ruin like that thing in Athens. And you get some sense of what it looked like and felt like, because it is the same size. It's in limestone, not marble, and it's nowhere near as beautiful, but still. And they have the giant statue of Athena inside. And I was there staring at it, and this little kid comes up to me and tugs my arm and says, "She's not real." Like he was worried that I'd gone all pagan on him. And it was actually rather touching, because he obviously was a well-brought-up Christian kid who wanted me to see that this was a pagan idol. But the fact is, for the Athenians, she was real. And that was the god. Again, this is so different. That little kid had a sense of the difference between paganism and Christianity, which I'm trying to recover for you here. But you see, this is a world in which Rome isn't the most important thing, it's the only thing, to paraphrase Vince Lombardi, the great modern Roman. That is, I want you to see how all-encompassing the city is for these people. You're not thinking of being, oh, well, I could be a playwright, or I could be a philosopher, or I could be a painter, I could become a famous painter. I mean, in this world, Rome is it. You know, if you're going to become famous, it's as a famous Roman general. That's it's virtually the only option here. This really focuses people's attention here. The city, it forms the horizon of these people. And these ancient cities were very different from modern communities. No separation of church and state, for example. You can't say, oh, well, I'm going to become a priest, and I'll become a cardinal, I'll become pope, I'll be very famous as the Pope of Rome. Well, that's a later option. It's not there. It's interesting. There aren't even priests in this play. That's historically inaccurate. There were priests in Rome. They were civic officials. But it's interesting that the religion in this play is totally saturated into the daily life of the city and almost coextensive with it. The gods are gods of the city. Okay, it's 10:25. Let's take a 10-minute break here, and then resume. Okay, I found my visual aid. Oh, actually, are we ready? Are we shooting here? Okay. I found my visual aid during the break. A week ago, I was in Las Vegas at something called Freedom Fest, which is advertised itself as the world's largest gathering of free minds. That also makes it the world's largest gathering of IRS agents, I might point out. But the theme of their conference this year was Are We Rome? And the worry of it was that we're losing our liberties the way Rome lost its liberties. I'll just pass this around because it's a good reminder of the fact that Rome is still a reference point in our culture, and the symbols of Rome are very much. You want to pass that around? The symbols of Rome are very much alive, and the conference was originally supposed to be in Caesar's Palace, but we got kicked out to Planet Hollywood. But I was put in the Ben-Hur room of Planet Hollywood, so it had some Roman connection left. But I spoke on Shakespeare's Roman plays and whether they're relevant to the contemporary United States, and so stuff's still alive. So did you have a question you want to ask? Yes, go.
Well, this is on the last two topics about which we spoke. So valor being the chiefest virtue, and then also the religious question. I'm curious as to how it is that acquiring relates to valor having this high position, as well as also how acquiring fits into the religious understanding.
Now, by acquiring, what do you mean?
Gaining material goods. For instance, towards the end, when they're within, towards the end of the battle in Act 1, they're still within Coriolanus, Shakespeare shows us first Roman, second Roman, and third Roman gathering booty and running back to Rome.
Yeah, well, that's the contrast, that for Coriolanus, it's not a matter of material gain. When he's offered a special share of the booty, he turns it down and says, I just want the common share. That's one of the ways in which Shakespeare contrasts the patrician and plebeian mentality in Rome, that the patricians are in war for the honor, for the triumph, for the conquest, and it's one of the signs of the baseness of the plebeians that they'll do it for material gain, and that's it's understandable. Again, Shakespeare has a very human appreciation, a sympathetic appreciation of the plebeians' humanity, of their ordinary concerns, but the true patrician, like Coriolanus, places himself above that. Okay, I just wanted to fill in that last point, and then we'll go on, I think, maybe to discuss Coriolanus' family here. But one of the interesting things intellectually, particularly about these plays, is we do know Shakespeare's sources very clearly, and the chief source for all three plays is Plutarch's Lives, and that often does allow us to see what Shakespeare's emphasizing. So I want to stress the absence of priests, and I'm going to add soothsayers in this play. You've got, one reason I like the Signet editions is they have some of the sources. If you turn to page 182, you'll see some of the stuff Shakespeare omits. This is the bottom of page 182. This is a moment when Coriolanus has gone over to the Volsces and Rome is wondering how to get him to abandon his plans of destroying the city. Now, on the other side, the city of Rome was in marvelous uproar and discord, the nobility against the commonalty, and chiefly for Marcia's condemnation and banishment. Moreover, the priests, the soothsayers, and private men also came and declared to the Senate certain sights and wonders in the air, which they had seen and were to be considered of. Now, Shakespeare omits that entirely, and I'll clue you in here. Watch for soothsayers in Julius Caesar. Watch for soothsayers in Antony and Cleopatra. Watch for sights and wonders in those plays. It's very interesting that Shakespeare had the option of including sights and wonders and soothsayers in Coriolanus. He had the material in Plutarch, but deliberately omits it. You have only excerpts. I'm going to read you something from the full version in Plutarch. Again, this is this moment when they're trying to deal with Coriolanus as their enemy. For then they appointed all the bishops, priests, minister of the gods, and keepers of holy things, and all the augurs or soothsayers, which foreshow things to come by observation of the flying of birds, which is an old kind of prophesying and divination among the Romans, to go to Martius apparelled as when they do their sacrifices. Now again, this is Thomas North's translation, as it happens, of a French translation of the original Greek in Plutarch. So, but there's mention of bishops, priests, and soothsayers, and then he continues, when all this goodly rabble of superstition and priests were returned. Moreover, you've got this in your edition on page 188. Here, the notion that Volumnia should go to Coriolanus comes from the woman Valeria in a vision. It's the bottom of page 188. So she suddenly fell into such a fancy, as we've rehearsed before, and had, by some goddess, I think, taken hold of a noble device. And then over on 189, when they come to Martius, about 6 lines down in 189, we ladies are come to visit you ladies, my lady, when they come to my lady Volumnia, by no direction from the Senate, nor commandment of other magistrate, but through the inspiration, as I take it, of some God above, who having taken compassion and pity of our prayers, has moved us to come unto you. Notice that it's stressed in Plutarch that the ladies come to Volumnia and Virgilia by no direction from the Senate, nor commandment of other magistrates. Shakespeare omits stuff like that. He omits anything that suggests that the gods are not coextensive with the city. In the Coriolanus we see in Shakespeare's play, they are Roman gods. The rulers of Rome claim to be in direct touch with these gods. The notion that there are private individuals who have a link to the gods, that's omitted from this play. You'll watch this in Julius Caesar. Watch it in Antony Cleopatra. The emergence of soothsayers, the emergence of people with private links to the gods. That's part of the transformation of Rome that Shakespeare portrays in these plays. So, again, this Roman regime, it claims to make everything Roman. So how about the family? And as we've said, we see one family in this play, and it's the family of Coriolanus. What can we say about the Roman family as we see it here? Again, it should look pretty different, yes.
One thing I noted in a footnote, because I kind of space in my paper, we talked about virtue and valor and fame a little bit, and it seemed like that those ideas were lifted above, filial ties. Coriolanus' mother said, something in plain English, basically, is better. I love you more if you died in a great way. Like the honor you bring to our family is a little bit more important than even my love for you.
Yeah.
So it's this idea of like the public is more important than the private family, and that honor is something that is like a virtue that's held above even this love.
Yeah, the famous Spartan line, the mother to the son, come home with your shield or on it. Yes.
And then just to add on to that, I think that's definitely in the spirit of what I wanted to say. But the interests of the public are so far above that of the private that Coriolanus is willing to march on Rome, despite the fact that his family is in it, and comes and begs him for their lives. And ultimately, he does end up submitting to that, but it isn't really because of his wife and son so much as it is because of his mother.
Yeah, that we'll come to that probably tomorrow as we end. But
Yeah, I was just going to say that even for the wife and the mother is really interesting because the wife is in some ways what we might think of as a compassionate family member, and that she's very worried about her husband being hurt. She's very worried. She doesn't want to go party out in the streets while he's off to battle. There's a lot of things, and basically they tell her, she's a sourpuss. She's no fun at all. They're going to go and leave her at home, and they're going to go out and see the streets and whatnot. And that the mother is really seen as, first of all, person who's in control. She actually dictates Coriolanus' actions to a much greater degree than anyone else. also clearly the figure who is praised by the rest of society, whereas the life is seen sort of dependent on a figure that's sort of overly emotional and sort of silly.
Yeah, by Roman standards, yes.
There's also that line that Coriolanus sucked valor from women's breasts, and it's the idea that the mother would be the one to transport this chief virtue to her son, and what that means for the degree to which Coriolanus respects his mother and wants her approval.
Yeah, and it's almost the approval of Rome. Now again, by our standards, what's missing in this family? Well, obviously, a very interesting, and Menenius is a kind of substitute father, but you know, I'm almost, you know, what's missing in this play by Hollywood standards? Yeah.
Degree of affection between the family.
Yeah, that's almost a weak word for it. Yeah, I mean, what do we miss in the Coriolanus Virgilia story here? Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird that Coriolanus's romantic speeches are almost always to men. So it'll say, like,
Bromance.
Yeah. I feel like when I wooed or whatever like that, and then he like hugs his enemy, hugs his best friend, and it's,
Yeah.
it's never with his wife. It's always
Yeah, in some ways, the most erotic relations in the play are among men, and especially this. You know, they think of it as like their marriage day when they get to hug. And the relation between Coriolanus and Virgilia is very austere. He says, "My gracious silence, hail," when he comes back. It's like there's a lot of words lost between Coriolanus and Virgilia are not very effusive in their affection, and when he's reunited with her in Act 5, he says, "My lip hath virgined it ever since." He's not like your typical soldier. Now I mention this because watch this in Julius Caesar and Antony Cleopatra. Watch how this changes. Yeah.
I think there's also, on the point of the father,
Yeah.
work of the father, on page 133,
Yeah.
when Volumnia is trying to convince Coriolanus to not fight,
Yeah.
and he approaches his son, and he speaks to his son at the bottom of line 70. The god of soldiers, with the consent of supreme Jove, inform thy thoughts with nobleness, that thou mayest prove to shame unvulnerable and sick the wars, like a great sea mark, standing every flaw and saving those that eye thee. So it's interesting that essentially he calls upon the god of soldiers, which we've said is kind of the gods are coextensive with the city. So he looks to the city and the city gods to teach his son about honor and valor, which is a role that we would ascribe to like a father. You know,
Yeah.
usually the father will teach his son how to be honorable, how to be
Yeah.
this and that. And so I thought that was interesting. That it kind of puts the power of what we see as the power of the father in the state.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing, this is a good way of seeing how the Roman community runs together with the family. That you're raising a soldier in this city, and indeed, Volumnia's incredible claim that she'd rather have 12 sons come home dead than one turned coward. What can we say about little Marcius in this play? What do we learn about? Well, we get an image in a way of the young Coriolanus and his son. Yeah.
Talk about like torturing the little bird.
Butterflies.
Butterflies.
Yeah.
And ripping it up.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, he's like this.
Yes. And it's kind of it's an interesting image because it's an image of capturing the butterfly, tormenting it, letting it go, capturing it again, tormenting it go. What does that point to in the play? Does that have a parallel in the play?
Sort of like choosing to be riled him up.
Ah.
They also do it to him too, though. So.
See, I'd seen it a different way, but that's something I want to think about. The Romans and the Volsces. it seems they beat them and then have a treaty with them and then beat them again. What does that suggest about patrician policy? How do the patricians use the plebeians? Use the Volskis. Yeah.
Almost as a constant threat to keep this martial culture up. As long as you have a threat, you can always justify your own power a little bit, and also because they say, you know, they can use excuse, well, we're just going to get constant, you're all going to get killed if you don't abide by our way.
Yeah, it's a very Machiavellian point. They use foreign policy as a part of domestic policy. In some ways, the only way they're able to keep the plebeians in line is with the Volscian threat. It means, now, again, all these things are set up, I think, to create a pattern in the three plays. It does mean that Rome is going to have a problem if it ever runs out of enemies. And watch that in Antony and Cleopatra. Yes?
It's also a game. You play and you go back and forth and you kind of let them think that they're winning, but ultimately you have the power and you always know that you can tear them down.
Yeah. So this is, yes.
Well, particularly in the discussion of gratitude, that the way to sort of keep the plebeians in line is that there are some of them that recognize that they have to be grateful to those that display this military virtue, and so, like, even when they're discussing amongst themselves, one of the citizens says, ingratitude is monstrous, and for the multitude to be ungrateful or to make a monster of the multitude, of the which we being members should bring ourselves to be monstrous members, and then later there's a discussion of how ungrateful Rome is to Coriolanus, so that's a way of sort of keeping everyone in line.
Yeah, and again, it's one of Shakespeare's tributes to the plebeians that they're pretty decent about this. They do not simply hate the great patricians, and they really have to be pushed to react against them, because they do understand that these are there's a greatness to these men and that they need them. And we see how it arises from the Roman patrician family, which is devoted to nothing but turning out warriors. It's said of little Marcius, he'd rather hear a drum than his schoolmaster. And that tells you an awful lot about the Roman upbringing. These are not going to be intellectuals. It's very interesting that, as you may know, Plutarch writes parallel lives. His book was The Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans. And the parallel life to Coriolanus is the life of Alcibiades. You guys heard of Alcibiades, one of the great Grecian generals. And at the parallel point in his life, his teacher is Socrates. As you may know, Alcibiades shows up in at least three, there's three Platonic dialogues, Alcibiades 1 and 2, and he's a major figure in the Symposium. And it's an interesting parallel. Plutarch was a Greek writing for Roman masters. Generally speaking, he tries to show the superiority of the Greek to the Roman in each of these parallels. As you may, you know, Coriolanus went over to the Volscis and almost conquered Rome. Alcibiades, an Athenian, led the war against Sparta, then defected to the Spartans and won Spartan victories over the Athenians. Then he went back to the Athenians and won Athenian victories over Spartans. That was Plutarch's demonstration. The Greek was a better trader than the Roman. But in any case, what's interesting structurally is at the point Coriolanus is lacking in an education. He's lacking in a father in Plutarch, and we see in his son in Shakespeare his defective education. He doesn't listen to his schoolmasters, whereas Alcibiades had a pretty good schoolmaster, a guy named Socrates. Anyway, when you look at this family, you see what it means that the city absorbs everything into its orbit, even the family. Even the family is there for generating Roman heroes. And indeed, what's really suppressed in this play is the erotic side of human nature. Now, did you get to, in Plato, the 3 parts of the soul? Did you do anything on that? Oh, you did. Okay, you didn't do. All right, so that. All right, then I won't go that route. But in any case, you can see this is a relatively austere world in which erotic impulses are suppressed. You guys know Shakespeare. There's usually dirty jokes in Shakespeare, right? There's plenty in Antony and Cleopatra. There's no dirty jokes in this play. There might be 1 or 2, but they're hard to find. In general, there's very little sign of the erotic life here. Now, you begin with a desire for food, but it's answered by something political, by giving them the tribunes. And in general, people call for wine at a couple of points of the play, but it never shows up. They offer food, but it never shows up. Generally, it's a whole world where people are neglecting the erotic side of life because they're so concerned with politics and honor and ambition. Again, that's the way Rome operates. It makes politics the focus of people's lives. Certainly for these patricians, their whole lives revolve about war and politics. Your great aim is to win a triumph, to be able to come home to Rome and celebrate a victory over a foreign enemy, as Coriolanus does. Your aim is to become consul. I mean, your whole life is focused on this. And the curious thing, even the plebeians, who are presented as, if you will, the people who are concerned with appetite in the community, even they can be diverted by a political reward given the tribunate. Even they are mostly concerned about politics. Shakespeare shows an incredibly focused world here where there's very little else in this world beyond politics. Coriolanus is banished from Rome. He says there's a world elsewhere. Where does he go? To Antium, and what life does he pursue there? Yeah, life of a warrior. There's senators there. It's kind of, it's as if these people can't think of anything but politics, and that's what Rome seems to represent to Shakespeare. What would it be like to focus a whole community on politics and therefore on war? And it has some remarkable results. Again, Rome achieves some remarkable things. I'm going to just suggest that Shakespeare thinks this life is somewhat limited. Now, again, think about it. In a way, we're always hearing about the importance of community and the importance of your nation and patriotism. We're told now America is lacking in community spirit, and there's a lot to be said for that. On the other hand, Shakespeare's saying, well, let's look at a community that really was totally communitarian. Let's look at a community in which there were no options. In which the family itself is part of, if you will, the political plan of the city. Let's look at a world in which religion is completely bound up with the community. Do we really want that world? I mean, it's a kind of test case for Shakespeare. I think he was interested in Republican Rome as a kind of extreme case of a human ideal, something we do admire and we keep recurring to. But we have to wonder, beware of what you wish for. If you could get a total community, would you really want to live in it? And you might ask, would Shakespeare want to live in it? Look what happens to poets in Julius Caesar. It's a very interesting indication of what. Again, I want to say that Shakespeare, I think, really admires Republican Rome. I think he thinks it's a remarkable community. And it is not lost on him what this little city eventually accomplished. Just think of it as this one city that first conquered Italy and then conquered southern France and Spain and eventually defeated the Greeks, defeated the Carthaginians. There was nothing you could throw up against this city that it couldn't defeat, and it ruled it. And the Romans had such a pride in their politics. You see it in the Aeneid. There's a great passage in the Aeneid. I think Aeneas is getting a prophecy in the underworld from his father Anchises, and it goes something like this: let other people trace the movement of the heavens, let other people give great speeches in the law courts, let other people produce beautiful statues, and this all means the Greeks. He says, but you're going to rule the world. And the attitude, and the Romans, in a certain sense, had an amazing inferiority complex. They first were the colony of the Etruscans, and then they came to Greece, and when they looked at the Parthenon, it was in better shape than now, and of course it blew them away. They had nothing like that in Rome. They were living in mud huts in Rome at that time. It's the way we picture Rome, is imperial Rome after they were imitating Greek architecture. So when the Romans saw the Greeks, they were stunned, and they felt like barbarians. Of course, the Greeks thought of them as barbarians, but then they beat them on the battlefield. And you see that Coriolanus speaks of contempt of the Greeks in this play. And he says, give out corn for free the way it was done in Greece. That's probably anachronistic for him to be referring to Greece at this stage in Roman history. But still, and watch for Greeks in Julius Caesar and Greeks in Antony Cleopatra. We're going to watch the Greekification, otherwise known as the Hellenization of Rome, as we watch these plays proceed. But I want you to have a sense here that the Romans took pride in what was Roman, and Rome was that army, those legions. And no matter what else you said about Rome, oh, your poetry sucks. Well, our armies don't. And that's you can see that word. But Shakespeare, in a sense, that means you've got a very limited world. You don't have a. Notice the. Again, it's so Shakespeare is so commanding these things. There's very little poetry in Coriolanus. I mean, it's all poetry, it's all iambic pentameter, but there's very little of to be or not to be. That is the question. There's very little of, oh, what light through yonder window breaks. It is the east and Julian. Can you picture Coriolanus saying that of Virgilia? No, this isn't a world of erotic love poetry. And Shakespeare, he crafts a play that captures the austerity of Republican Rome here. It's amazing that, again, that Antony Cleopatra and Coriolanus were written at the same time. If they weren't written by both written by the greatest playwright who ever lived, you wouldn't know they were by the same poet. In a way, the poetry of Coriolanus is very different from the poetry of Antony Cleopatra. We'll see that when we start studying Antony Cleopatra. But as if Shakespeare has crafted a poetic idiom to different stages of Roman history here. One appropriate to this austere republic, one appropriate to this decadent and erotic empire that emerges. Okay, let's talk some more about now Coriolanus. This, in a certain sense, the noblest Roman of them all, the perfect embodiment of Roman virtue, and the guy that can't fit into the city. So tell me something about his nature, and why we're actually said his nature is too noble for the world. Yes?
I think one of the key scenes here is when he refuses to put on the dress of appear.
Yeah, or take off the dress, as the case may be. Yeah.
He's not a politician in the same sense that we think of them now. He's very much concerned with, when he's in the public sphere, he's better than everybody else. He's not willing to play by the same rules as everybody else. And in some sense, that makes him a weaker politician, but in his own sense, that makes him stronger.
A nobler man. There's a real contradiction he feels between his political role and his own sense of nobility.
And I think the way you phrased it was very accurate, that he doesn't seem to fit into the system. And I think it goes back to the point we were saying that the Republican system relies on people who essentially blur the lines between the patricians and the plebeians, because you need people to be able to connect with the plebeians, and then you need the reverse. And he's such an extreme of like a patrician who, we've seen he just abandons his, when after conquering, he doesn't really care about kind of the money or the wealth that's there for taking, and he just really cares about glory and honor and kind of battlefield victory, to the point where he can't fit into the society that depends on some level of cooperation between the classes.
Yeah, it's here we get some sense of why this play is so deeply tragic. That the very virtues that make him a great warrior and a conqueror unfit him for domestic politics in Rome. This is not an uncommon theme. The tension between military virtue and political virtue. A great example in American history was Douglas MacArthur, who was a great, great general and thought he was going to become president as a result of that, and then got into a political conflict with Harry Truman. And it's so funny. I mean, if we were in Shakespeare's world, MacArthur would have gone over to Korea at that point and led the North Koreans to conquer the U.S. But fortunately, we're not in that kind of world. And the funny thing was Dwight Eisenhower, who became president, the general who was known for his ability to compromise, who was chosen for the European theater by George Marshall because he was thought of as the one who could be supreme Allied commander and work with jerks like Patton and Montgomery, prima donnas, generals who just cared about their glory. Patton was a much greater field commander than Eisenhower, perhaps the greatest field commander in the Western theater, and yet very unpolitical. Have you guys seen the movie Patton? That's the most Shakespearean movie, I think the most Shakespearean work of art of the 20th century. By the way, Francis Ford Coppola wrote the script. I think the closest any 20th century artist came to a Shakespearean vision is that and I feel if Shakespeare had been alive in the 20th century, he would have done Patton, or he would have written about MacArthur, that these were figures that embodied the kind of problematic that he was interested in. It was something that was very much alive in Shakespeare's world, I should point out, that the Elizabethan situation was fraught with tension because you had a queen who was a very effective ruler, a very shrewd ruler, but had one limitation, that she could not be a field commander, being a woman. And that was fairly unusual because most kings then were still expected to lead their armies into battle. And Elizabeth was surrounded by would-be warrior generals. The Earl of Essex was the most famous example, but you can think Sir Walter Raleigh. She had a very tense relationship with the great men in her court who led military expeditions, sometimes against the Spanish, for example, sometimes against the rebellious Irish. And she had a real tension whether one of those generals would lead a coup. The Earl of Essex did stage a rebellion against her and was executed for it. So anyway, I'm saying that Shakespeare, just looking at his own world, I'm saying these plays are about Rome, and I think they really are. I'm not saying that Shakespeare's own experience of his day was utterly irrelevant to this. And so I think one thing he observed in Elizabethan England was a particularly acute situation between the ruler and the military leaders, in a situation where the military leaders would win a great victory and then think, well, Elizabeth should marry me and I should be king now. And that she was very careful not to let that happen. So when you see the tension between a man who can accomplish something in war and his ineptitude in peacetime, there were a lot of examples of that in Shakespeare's day, and one after another of these guys ended up in the Tower of London. You know, Walter Raleigh, the great cavalier, the great courtier, he ends up in the Tower of London because they thought he was too ambitious and somehow aiming at the throne. It's very interesting. In Shakespeare's Henry V, the beginning of Act 5, when Henry V has won the Battle of Agincourt and is returning to England, Shakespeare has the chorus compare it to a Roman triumph, so that Henry V returning victorious to London is like a Caesar returning to Rome. And then Shakespeare throws it, compares it to the Earl of Essex returning from Ireland. When that play was written, they had great hopes for the Earl of Essex. Later, I'm sure Shakespeare's a little bit embarrassed that he had that line in the play. By the way, the Earl of Essex, when he was trying to create a rebellion against Elizabeth, had Shakespeare's company stage Richard II. Essex's hope was people would see the scene of Richard being deposed and be inspired to go and depose Elizabeth. Elizabeth was quoted as saying, "I am that Richard." And they hauled Shakespeare's, the owner of the company, into court. Francis Bacon was the prosecutor, by the way. It means he didn't write Shakespeare's plays. And they let the guy off. He said, they gave us £100 to stage the play. That's a lot of money. We didn't know there was a rebellion. And they actually let him go. But I mention this to show that people in Shakespeare's day were making real political connections. The Earl of Essex said, how can I overthrow Elizabeth? Let's stage a Shakespeare play and show a monarch deposed. Again, the Shakespeare's company was very lucky that a lot of people were imprisoned and a couple of people executed. In fact, Shakespeare's patron, the Earl of Southampton, was associated with Essex and was sentenced to death, and it was commuted. So Shakespeare had a lot of connections to this Essex party. And when you see failed military leaders in Shakespeare, and there are a lot of them, there's Macbeth, there's Coriolanus, there's Mark Antony, there's Othello. He was fascinated by the subject, and one reason may very well be that what he witnessed in his own day was failed military leaders who pushed it a little too far. Now, tell me something about Coriolanus's pride. What forms does it take? What does it reveal about him? Yeah.
The one that struck me the most was in the first week we read Aristotle.
Yeah.
He like greatness of soul.
Yeah.
And that the truly great person is one that constantly seeks honor, but then also sees like people that honor him like sort of a disparaging way. That it's almost like demeaning to be honored by people less than you.
Yeah.
For the person who's in greatness of soul. So
This is Aristotle's great souled man.
right.
That's it. Yeah.
Well, this is exactly
Yeah.
this is basically Aristotle, like the type
Yeah.
of person that Aristotle describes.
Aristotle says of him, he speaks in irony except to the vulgar.
Right.
And that's Coriolanus right there. Yeah.
So I'm more thinking about when he came back from, he was being elected to council. He's dressed in like these humble clothing, and he keeps getting showered with praise, but keeps kind of shunning it in a way, but in a way that keeps him like in a very high-handed, very self-regarding manner.
Yeah. Why doesn't he like praise? In some ways, we feel he's. Well, anyway, I'll go to you again.
Well, he's above it. He doesn't need their praise. And part of this is the refusal to show the scars that he's gotten in war. he's very hesitant to do this. And on the one hand, you would think, why? Because, this is an enormous point of power for him. He's earned these scars defending the people, but he insists, thinking of this passage right at the end of 2.2, where he won't show them, he says, because as if I received them for the hire of their breath only.
Yeah. He is obsessed with the idea that nothing should be instrumental about his honor, because that would suggest he does something for hire or pay. By the way, in Plutarch, he shows his wounds. Again, this is a detail that Shakespeare added, his hesitancy to show his wounds. What emotion is he showing there? I mean, I have to say, I wouldn't be too thrilled to take off my clothing in public. Why don't we want to do that? What's deep emotion, man?
He sees that sort of showcasing as a bit vulgar.
Yeah, it's shame. I'm just kidding. So he's very much in the grip of shame as an emotion. Yeah.
There's an odd way, though, in which, maybe you can claim that honor can be independent from other people's judgment, although I think that's dubious, but certainly shame is entirely social.
Yeah.
It's odd to be so disdainful of the public when the public is really what is conferring.
Yeah, that there's an inner contradiction in his character that Shakespeare is really exploring him. Look at page 48. And again, these are officers. I guess they're not plebeians, therefore, but I'm not sure. But anyway, they're very thoughtful. This is Act 2, Scene 2. He's vengeance proud and loves not the common people. And then the second officer tries to defend him. Faith, there have been many great men that have flattered the people who ne'er loved them, and there be many that they have loved, they know not wherefore, so that if they love, they know not why, they hate upon no better ground. Therefore, for Coriolanus neither to care whether they love or hate him manifests the true knowledge he has in their dispositions, and out of his noble carelessness lets them plainly see it. This is the view of him as a great souled man who's above it. But the first officer is shrewd. He says if he did not care whether he had their love or no, he weighed indifferently twixt doing them neither good nor harm. But he seeks their hate with greater devotion than they can render it him, and leaves nothing undone that may fully discover him their opposite. Now to seem to affect the malice and displeasure of the people is as bad as that which he dislikes to flatter them for their love. That's a really profound insight, that if Coriolanus were really indifferent to the people, he wouldn't be so contemptuous of them. By the way, that passage comes from the comparison of Alcibiades and Coriolanus. Again, Plutarch's lives, there's a life of Alcibiades, a life of Coriolanus, and then a comparison. Almost always the Shakespeare scholars omit the comparisons. It's certainly not in your excerpts in Coriolanus, and even a book that purports to give you Shakespeare's Plutarch omits the comparisons. If you're ever seriously into this, be sure to read the comparisons which Shakespeare did, and that is Plutarch develops exactly that logic in his comparison of Alcibiades and Coriolanus, because he's always trying to show the superiority of the Greek. Alcibiades was a magnificent rhetorician and knew how to flatter the Athenian people. Not only got elected general, even after being a traitor and going over and winning the battles for Sparta, he managed to talk the Athenians again into making him general. There's nothing like that in human history. As I always, it's as if Vladimir Putin now could run for president of the United States, win an election, and then go back to. It just doesn't happen. And Alcibiades did it. And Plutarch makes just that argument there, that there was something defective in Coriolanus, that he couldn't bring himself to deal with the people, and Alcibiades was able to do it, which made him made Alcibiades more philosophical, which you would expect of the pupil of Socrates. So in a way, Coriolanus is a defective great-souled man. You can see that Aristotelian ideal is at play here, but there are crucial ways in which Coriolanus fails to have the true indifference. By the way, I don't know if you discussed this, but I believe that Aristotle's portrait of the magnanimous man is an esoteric portrait of the philosopher. Did you discuss this? I mean, that it's actually Aristotle's portrait of Socrates, especially that line, he speaks in irony except to the vulgar, and that the defect of the average, ordinary, great-souled man is that he's not truly philosophical. I think Aristotle's portrait of the magnanimous man points to the philosopher as the only true great-souled man. And you see that in Coriolanus, that there's a kind of unphilosophical defect in Coriolanus, that he both takes the common people seriously and refuses to do so. Again, if he really had a true philosophical contempt for them, he wouldn't bother to debate them and infuriate them so much. You see it, such a marvelous portrait that he remembers that man who once helped him in Corioli, and asks Cominius for one favor. But what happens? He forgets his name. And that's a perfect illustration of the great-souled man who doesn't like to remember favors because he doesn't like to be dependent on anyone. What you see again and again in Coriolanus is an obsessive fear of dependence. So he doesn't want anybody to think he got these wounds because he wanted to be consul. He doesn't want to listen to Cominius praise him because he doesn't want to think he did this to get the praise. Now, secretly, he wants the praise. He wants to be consul. He's been brought up for that. He is not indifferent to the people. When he says he is, there's a world elsewhere, he goes to another people, becomes their general. You begin to see here the great tragic tension in this play between the city and its great man. I like to use the image of a marriage and the notion of can't live with him, can't live without him. That is, when you see the relation of the city to Coriolanus, to its great man, in a certain sense it is, from Rome's point of view, Coriolanus can't live with him, can't live without him. And by the same token, from Coriolanus's view with regard to Rome, it's Rome, I can't live with it, I can't live without it. You really see this is something deeply tragic in the human situation here. You've got this city that needs great men. I mean, it needs them for the sheer military factor. And again, it's so much more acute in a world where you're one step away from annihilation of your city and slavery and whatever. And so it desperately needs this great man. And yet, what a pain in the ass he is. He is so demanding and is so aware of his greatness and flaunts it, on fair ground I could beat 40 of them. Trying to picture an American politician saying that. Talk about a career-ending comment. And you just know there are moments in politics when you want to say the equivalent of that. You have it trained out of you. Any sign of conscious superiority in an American politician would be the end of the career right there. It was probably MacArthur's problem. Manchester's biography is called The American Caesar, and he kind of acted like a Caesar. But from Coriolanus's point of view, it's the same problem, that he keeps saying, I don't need this city. I don't need your praise. I don't need your honors. I don't need your votes. The great line when the plebeians ask him, so why are you here in the marketplace? What hath brought you here in the marketplace? He says, my own desert, not mine own desire. Again, what an impossible political comment. I'm just trying to picture an American politician say, well, why do you want to be president? Because I deserve to be president. I'm the greatest American. I'm so much better, not just than my opponents, but every one of you out there. I mean, what an end to a political career that would be. So he pretends that he doesn't need the city, but what's his profession? He's a general. He needs soldiers. Now, it's true, he takes it as far as you can. He goes in single-handedly to conquer Coriolanus, but in the end, he can't do it. Yes?
Well, I think to make another comparison with Aristotle, Aristotle calls courage a virtue, which Coriolanus clearly has, but there's also, you can have an excess of courage, which becomes recklessness. And Coriolanus never backs down, ever. He never recognizes that retreat, or at least some sort of moderate response to your opposition, would be prudent.
Yeah.
That's useful, I guess, when he runs into the enemy gate and single-handedly kills all the soldiers, opens it, and lets the Roman army rush in. But in politics, you can't be so final.
Yeah, just in support of what you say, look at bottom of page 25. Where Cominius says, breathe you, my friends, well fought. We are come off like Romans, neither foolish in our stands, nor cowardly in retire. That's pure Aristotle right there. And it is the notion that, Cominius is a patrician, he's consul, and he knows there are times when you have to retreat. And that just forging ahead can be disastrous. And I hadn't noticed how Aristotelian the formulation there, but it's the pure mean there, not foolish nor cowardly. And Coriolanus, things work great for him most of the time, but you're right that actually in war, his unwillingness to retreat pretty much pays off. But his problem is in peacetime politics. What goes wrong with him there? What argument does Volumnia make to him about why he should, go to the marketplace and plead with the plebeians? Remember, it's again along the lines where you say yes.
She does say that actions become eloquence. So that doing this would communicate something that you can otherwise.
She actually makes a military argument to them. This would be in Act 3, Scene 2. And by the way, you're looking really good now. Page 84, line 39, you are too absolute. She tells them, though therein you could never be too noble, but when extremities speak. She says to him, don't you use deception in war? If it be honor in your wars to seem the same you are not, which for your best ends you adopt your policy, how is it less or worse that it shall hold companionship and peace with honors of war, since that both stands in like request? Now, in fact, he doesn't use deception in war. He really is a straightforward guy. That's why Ophidius thinks he can control him and ultimately defeat him. His whole problem in war is he's never thought to use deception. Let's just fight it out. Yes?
Right, and I think that while that really brave action he took in the battle paid off in this instance, there are plenty of examples in military history. The entire story of General Custer involves just rationally going into this battle saying, my men can do it.
Yeah.
Against totally superior force, you're going to get annihilated.
Yeah, yes.
I think it goes to what Machiavelli says about princes who can't change.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
And, Volumnia tells him that she dissemble with my nature, and Coriolanus just refuses to do that. And because he can't change circumstances, or with circumstances, he's always kind of going to be a defective prince then.
Yeah.
According to Machiavelli.
By the way, there's a whole speech that Ophidius gives towards the end of the play about how men have to change with the times. That's pure Machiavellian. So, yes.
Well, I was just going to say that sometimes it almost approaches comedy. I mean, when Coriolanus is talking with Menenius, he tells him that he needs to be mild, when
Yeah.
you're speaking to the people.
Yeah.
Just be a little bit more moderate. Just don't be yourself, essentially.
Yeah.
And then he just can't do that. I mean, he says, "Let them accuse me by invention. I will answer in mine honor." And that really is the challenge for the great souled man, is that he's not supposed to sort of be any less than what he is or any more than what he is. And that's essentially what Coriolanus is saying. He's saying, I'm just going to be exactly what my honor deserves, and nothing more, nothing less. And then everyone's saying, well, that fails politically.
Yeah, Shakespeare was fascinated with that fact. If you guys know Hotspur in the Henry IV plays, it's the same phenomenon. And what Shakespeare shows there about Prince Hal, soon to be Henry V, is he has to learn how to deceive. It's a very Machiavellian lesson that honesty in politics doesn't get you very far in Shakespeare. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to add more to add to what Brooke just said. I mean, becoming, the idea of Machiavelli and changing and adapting to things. And it just seems like deception would, in a way, betray the image he had of himself.
Yeah.
And Machiavelli, the prince, to a certain extent, was all about the perception of people. You can be a terrible person as long as people perceive you to be a good person to go. But it seems in this case, he doesn't care how people look at him as long as he knows what he's with and what
Yeah.
who he is. People care about.
Yes?
So on the tail end of Brooke's point also, I'm wondering if the tragedy of this is one that is only a Republican problem. If Rome could still tolerate kings, would this be a problem?
Well, kings are a real problem, and we'll see that emperors are a real problem.
Would magnanimity in this way be a problem? Would the inability to dissemble be a problem for a king?
In an ideal king, perhaps not, but one of the problems with the monarchy is how you generate the king. And just to go to Shakespeare's history plays, he's very aware of the problem of succession and what Machiavelli, the problem of the legitimate prince. That is, one thing you see in this play is how republics do generate great warriors and great leaders. Monarchies will not do it, because a monarchy could start up under a great warrior, but his son is going to be effete. He's going to be raised a pampered little prince. He's going to inherit the throne. He's going to have none of the toughness you need in your ruler. What you see, the thing that Shakespeare admires about republics is that it generated a succession of powerful figures. And you see how, now Coriolanus is too extreme. And one of the things I think this play suggests is that the patricians learn a certain lesson from Coriolanus, that they're not going to be such idiots in public and display their contempt. So monarchy doesn't solve a problem because you can't keep generating good monarchs. And the history of the Roman Empire was a good example of that. So one thing we're seeing here is republics generate the kind of warrior leaders you want, and then the answer is to control them, and the nice thing is they're disposable because they're replaceable. It becomes a problem when you get an irreplaceable leader, and that's the issue of Julius Caesar. But, Coriolanus doesn't work out. Well, there's more Coriolani around, and that's sort of Machiavelli's theme about the Republic, and I think Shakespeare picks up on this. And again, it would explain this incredible sequence of military rulers that Rome produced that allowed it to conquer the world. And whenever they needed somebody, somehow they had him there. And even as it turned out, if they needed an aggressive general, they had him. If they needed a not-so-aggressive general like Fabius, he was available when they needed him. The whole principle of the Republic is let's have a lot of leaders available so we can get the one we need at a given moment. And the sad thing about the Republic is ingratitude, that they will they'll use you as long as you need you, and then they will dump you. But the Republic survives, the individual leaders may not. But there's a lot of them, and there's a rapid succession. And again, the monarchy looks wonderful when you got a good monarch. But the heredity does not seem to work as a political principle. That good monarchs do not have children who make good monarchs. And it may, I mean, Shakespeare explores this in the Henry IV plays, which are about the education of a monarch. It basically shows if you do grow up in a court, you're not going to be a good king. And the key to Prince Hal is that he grows up outside the court and does become a good king. But that's the problem. Monarchies don't seem to have a good mechanism for generating a succession of effective kings. And certainly the history of England is a wonderful example of that. Every great warrior king has a wretch as a successor. And the problem of succession was a huge problem in Shakespeare's day. They really, who was going to succeed Elizabeth? And they ended up with a wretch. I mean, this James guy who, and what, 2 monarchs down the line, they had to behead him. Where are we now? Oh, yeah, we were did you have a comment? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question, actually. You said republics generate great leaders and military generals and everything. And I'm just wondering, this city, or Rome in this case, is not a city of soldiers, right? As much as they, bearing children and sons who are going to be soldiers, it's not a city of soldiers. And it seems at some point, some people are going to kind of show themselves better than others. And I'm just wondering, would you say that there are people right now, or maybe, who, even though it's a politically, a career-ending statement, have the right, I don't know if I'm using that word right, have the right to say, I deserve to be president because I'm better than everyone. In this case, in the city, there's people like that, right?
Yeah, it's I will say this, and it is remarkable how America has generated great military leaders and great soldiers. And one country after another has underestimated the ability of democracies to develop military leaders. It was Napoleon's problem with England. It was Hitler's problem with England. I mean, time and again, relatively military societies have thought that democracies will fail in producing military leaders. And I have to say, it's just extraordinary, the history of America producing generals and soldiers when it's needed them. I hope that will continue. One actually wonders now with certain trends in the military whether that will be true. And now we're relying on technology. We think we don't need generals and soldiers anymore. Our technology will win our wars for us. We may elect a drone president in future decades at the rate we're going. Well, it won the war. But anyway, but it is now Rome. For example, Sparta was the great model in the ancient world of a city of soldiers, and where to be Spartan was to be a soldier. Rome is curious because you cannot simply say to be Roman is to be a soldier. The plebeians in this play are not portrayed as soldierly, yet they are the soldiers on which ultimately the Roman success depends. We see them, they seem to flee. They don't want to go into battle. They often run away. They go to loot when they've won. They really, again, you can say the remarkable thing about Rome is it managed to organize a non-soldierly population into a great army. And it did that with these patrician leaders who are bred to be soldiers. And the classic thing about the Roman army throughout its history is the the enlisted men, well, the common soldiers feared their officers more than any enemy. I mean, if you went to battle, you had some chance of staying alive. If you fled battle, you were immediately killed by your officers. So that was the fundamental fact about the Roman army. And so they were in terror. You've heard of decimation. It's a word that's always used incorrect. Decimation was when the army did something wrong. They arbitrarily killed every 10th man in the army. That's what decimation literally meant. And that kind of tended to keep people in line because it didn't even matter if you were the guy that made the mistake. The odds were 1 in 10 you were going to be killed once they invoked decimation on your unit. So it was, Shakespeare doesn't go into those details, but the Roman army had a pretty remarkable discipline based on principles like that. And again, it is absolutely remarkable how effective the Roman army was. It almost never broke ranks in a battle. Occasionally it did happen. Hannibal was able to do that. But generally they were incredibly well organized. And it's interesting that in Polybius's chapter on the Roman regime, half of it is about the organization of the Roman army. You get some sense of that in Coriolanus. That Coriolanus threatens to turn on his own soldiers and he kind of awes them into battle. But you can say this is the success of Rome, that it created a great army out of non-soldierly people. And then again, it's the issue of numbers. Sparta, there were 300 Spartans. And they were great on defense, and they could hold off the whole Persian army. But Rome was able to generate huge armies because they could shape a non-soldierly population into soldiers. Anyway, but it's a really good point that I think you see in this play, that non-soldiers become the army here. Anyway, as I was saying, I was trying to formulate the tragedy here. This fundamental tension between the city and its great heroes, that they both need each other and can't live with each other. That in some ways the city makes the city demands compromise of the uncompromising hero. By the same token, the hero cannot stand alone. I mean, if Coriolanus were a painter, he could stand alone. If he were a philosopher, he could stand alone. But a general can't stand alone. Now, it's very interesting. The tribunes sense this in him. They say, where is this man who would depopulate the city and be every man himself? They understand that impulse in Coriolanus, and he himself formulates it on page 132 when he says at line 35, I'll never be such a gosling to obey instinct, but stand as if a man were author of himself and knew no other kin. That's the heart of the great-souled man, namely self-sufficiency. That is the great aim of these ancient heroes is self-sufficiency. You see it in Achilles. It's the great theme of the Iliad. It's in a way the great theme of Greek tragedy. It's something that Plato and Aristotle analyze, and that culminates in Aristotle's analysis of the great-souled man. And Shakespeare pursues it here. That's at the heart of Coriolanus, this contradiction that he would like to be self-sufficient, but he's a human being. And of course, do not ever say in front of your mother that a man were author of himself and knew no other kin. Again, it's so built into that scene, the inner contradiction of this kind of ancient hero, that you could stand and say to your mother that you want to be author of yourself, and then he's finished. That this is not going to work. You cannot say to your mother that you're author of yourself, and that's what's going to undermine him in that scene. We'll get back to that tomorrow. But self-sufficiency is, again, it's it's something that the ancient world was fascinated with. We're very social people now. Coriolanus would not have gone for Twitter. He wouldn't have been into the social media. I have to say I have a little Coriolanus streak in me, and I cannot believe people who cannot now walk down the street without being in touch with someone. To me, the best moments of my life are when I'm alone, like walking in the Swiss Alps alone. And I can't picture tweeting someone from the Swiss Alps to say, I'm in the Swiss Alps right now. I'm really enjoying the Swiss Alps. I wish you were here with my... No, I'm in the Swiss Alps, so I don't have to talk to anybody. So I really understand Coriolanus. And, again, this was the characteristic of a god in the ancient world. That's, again, something that's a little hard for us to understand, that becoming a god was a living option in the ancient world. And one of the signs of it would be your self-sufficiency. The gods of this world, they're very different from a Jewish or a Muslim or Christian conception of God. It's really, when this scene, Act 5:3, Coriolanus, what does he say? He says the gods look down and laugh. Yeah. This is on page 137, line 185. The gods look down, and this unnatural scene they laugh at. The gods laugh at human weakness in the ancient world. Again, that's God has great compassion for human weakness. That's how we picture God now. In Book 1 of the Iliad, Hephaestus was lame. At the end of Book 1, the gods laugh at his lameness. It's very politically incorrect. But the Greek sense of the gods, as I like to put it, they knew the gods were powerful. They had very little sense that they were just or compassionate, and the gods look down at this unnatural scene and laugh at it. You laugh at people beneath you. It's a very aristocratic notion of the gods. And in a certain sense, Coriolanus wants to be a god. He wants to be self-sufficient, not to need anybody, and to be able to laugh at human weakness. Now again, that would not go over well in American politics. Someone who did a joke about someone's lameness. Talk about the end of a political career. Yeah. Right. If he had more of a sense of humor, he'd be more philosophical and handle this. But this now, people. Let's remember, it is a serious consideration in the play whether he can become a god. He fails, but it's important to see that it's a serious consideration. Whereas Menidius say that he lacks. It's page 117. Comitius says, line 90, of the Volscians, he is their god. He leads them like a thing made by some other deity than nature that shapes men better. And they follow him against us brats with no less confidence than boys pursuing summer butterflies. That's Martius again. Now, you're absolutely right that he fails at being a god, but he comes awfully close. And at several points in the play, people say he's like a god. And this is, this is very strange to us. Remember, the Roman emperors were deified. This got really serious when Julius Caesar was assassinated. The Senate enrolled him as the gods and built a temple to him right in the Forum. And starting with Augustus, the emperors were deified during their lifetime. This is what Jews objected to. This is what Christians objected to, that they were being asked to worship a human being as God. You know, everybody else in the Mediterranean, they had 47 gods to begin with, so one more god, big deal. But to people who believed in one God, this was the sticking point. And the Romans would put up with anybody as long as you accepted the emperor as a god. You could have all the gods you wanted, but you had to have this one. But when you say there's only one God and the emperor's not one of them, that doesn't work. But I mean, this is so crazy to us that we really have to work to recapture the sense that this isn't a metaphor. This isn't just a public relations thing. They would put the emperor on a coin imaged as a divinity. And there were temples to the emperors everywhere. And you had to go worship the emperor. This was a real, and of course it drove some of them nuts. Imagine being told you're a god. My students tell me it all the time, but I take it in stride. Anyway, you have a question?
Well, before when we were kind of distinguishing the patricians and the plebeians, does this element of self-sufficiency get at the true heart of what kind of distinguishes them? And Machiavelli touches upon the difference in natures of the grandi and the populace.
Yes, yeah. In other words, the people. Self-sufficiency means nothing to them. They're very dependent, and they're happy to be dependent. They accept that. They do. Now remember, the plebeians were not slaves. They were slaves in Rome, but the plebeians were free men. And they didn't want to be treated like slaves. That's part of the issue. But they tweet all the time. They're really very happy with the social media. And the patricians have this honor, this sense of shame, this sense of self-reliance, but most of them don't carry it to this Coriolanus extreme. He really takes it to the limit, and you can put it, put it this way. In a certain sense, he wants to be a god. That's why he's saying, I don't need this city. You should worship me, but I shouldn't have to make any concessions to you. I'm so great, you should just fall down and worship me. And they're doing that. The amazing thing is that, page 45, Brutus complains about this. Line 219, seld shown flamens. By the way, it's interesting. Priests rarely seen in public. This is the only reference to priests in the play. And they hardly ever appear. To press among the popular throngs and puff to win a vulgar station. Our veiled dames commit the war of white and damask in their nicely gilded cheeks to the one spoiled Phoebus burning kisses. Such a pother as if that whatsoever god who leads him were slyly crept and resumed powers and gave him graceful posture. And this isn't just, poetic language in the play. He's really like a god to these people. And it's a great danger to the Roman regime. Yes?
At this point in the Republic, have the optimate popularity that
I don't think so, but I'm not sure. Remember, this is very early. They have just invented the tribunate. People are talking about it. Coriolanus talking about eliminating it. It survives, and that turns out to be very important. This regime, which appears very unstable here, has a strange stability out of its turbulence. We begin to see here how a regime can last out of the balance of powers.